What happens when a seasoned political journalist refuses to back down from her principles on live television? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Nicolle Wallace, the former White House Communications Director turned MSNBC host, found herself in an unprecedented battle of wits with Stephen Colbert that would end with security escorting her off the set. This wasn't your typical promotional interview gone slightly off script. This was a full-blown ideological war that erupted when Colbert decided to ambush his guest with loaded questions and personal attacks that crossed every line of professional journalism. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about hosts who use their platform to attack their guests. Now, let's dive into what really happened that night when Nicolle Wallace stepped onto what she thought would be a friendly chat show, only to find herself defending not just her career, but her entire reputation against a host who seemed determined to destroy her credibility on national television. The green room at the Late Show had been unusually quiet that evening. Nicolle Wallace sat reviewing her notes, expecting the standard promotional interview format she had experienced dozens of times before. Her latest book was climbing the bestseller charts, and her MSNBC show continued to dominate the ratings. In its time slot, she had appeared on Colbert's show twice before, both times engaging in what she considered respectful political discourse, despite their obvious ideological differences. Tonight felt different from the moment she walked into the studio. The usual warm greeting from production staff seemed forced, and when Stephen Colbert approached her backstage, his smile didn't reach his eyes. There was something calculating in his demeanor that immediately put her on edge. "Ready for some fun tonight, Nicolle?" Colbert had asked, but the way he emphasized the word fun made it sound more like a threat than a promise of entertainment. Wallace, being the seasoned political operative she was, recognized the tone immediately. She had heard it countless times. In Washington boardrooms and press briefings, that particular inflection that meant someone was about to attempt a political assassination. She straightened her shoulders and smiled back. "Always ready, Stephen. I hope you've done your homework." Little did she know that Colbert had indeed done his homework, but not the kind that leads to insightful political commentary. He had spent weeks researching every controversial decision she had made during her time in the Bush administration, every perceived contradiction in her current political positions, and every personal detail he could weaponize for maximum damage. As they took their positions on set, the audience was buzzing with anticipation. The Late Show had been promoting this appearance for days, billing it as a major political discussion with one of the most respected voices in political journalism. The audience expected the usual Colbert charm, perhaps some gentle ribbing about political differences, maybe a few jokes about cable news personalities. What they were about to witness would be unlike anything in the show's history. The cameras rolled, and Colbert launched into his monologue with his characteristic wit, but those paying close attention could sense an undercurrent of aggression. That seemed unusual, even for his typically pointed political commentary. "Tonight we have with us Nicolle Wallace," Colbert announced to applause, former Bush administration official, current MSNBC host, and author of the new book that's apparently flying off the shelves, faster than fact-checkers can keep up with. Her TV show. The audience laughed, but Wallace's smile faltered slightly. That wasn't the introduction they had discussed. She had provided talking points about her book, her journalism career, and her perspective on current political events. This felt like the opening salvo in what was shaping up to be a very different kind of interview than she had prepared for. Wallace walked onto the stage with practiced confidence, waving to the audience as she settled into the guest chair. The studio lights felt hotter than usual, and she noticed Colbert's researchers positioned just off camera, armed with tablets and documents. This level of preparation was unusual for what was supposed to be a light-hearted late-night appearance. Colbert shuffled his index cards with theatrical precision, his famous smirk more pronounced than she remembered from their previous encounters. "So, Nicolle," Colbert began, leaning forward with exaggerated interest, "let's talk about your fascinating journey from spinning lies for George Bush to supposedly telling the truth on cable news. How does one make such a dramatic transformation without suffering from whiplash?" The audience chuckled nervously, sensing the hostile undertone in what sounded like a question, designed to trap rather than illuminate. Wallace maintained her composure, recognizing the loaded nature of the question immediately. "Well, Stephen, I think you're mischaracterizing both my previous role and my current work. As communications director, my job was to accurately represent the administration's policies and decisions to the press and public. Now, as a journalist, my job is to analyze and critique those same kinds of decisions, regardless of which party makes them." Colbert's eyes lit up with predatory gleam. "Oh, so you were just following orders then? That's a fascinating defense. Tell me, when you were helping sell the American people on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, were you just being accurate or were you being deliberately misleading?" The question hit like a sledgehammer, and Wallace felt the temperature in the room shift dramatically. "That's an unfair characterization of both the intelligence at the time and my specific role," Wallace responded, her voice steady but her jaw tightening. "The intelligence community provided assessments that proved to be incorrect, but suggesting that anyone was deliberately misleading the American people is both historically inaccurate and personally offensive." Colbert leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was creating. "Personally offensive? That's interesting because I find it personally offensive when people in positions of power help launch wars based on information they should have questioned more thoroughly. But maybe that's just me being sensitive about dead soldiers and destabilized regions." The audience was completely silent now, the usual laughter and applause replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the studio. Wallace could feel her media training kicking in, the years of hostile press briefings and congressional hearings preparing her for exactly this kind of ambush. But this wasn't a political opponent or partisan journalist. This was supposed to be entertainment television. "Stephen, I came here tonight to discuss my book and my current work in journalism. If you want to relitigate every foreign policy decision made 15 years ago, perhaps you should have been more upfront about that when your producers booked this appearance," Wallace said, her voice carrying just enough edge to signal that she wasn't going to be steamrolled. Colbert's response was swift and cutting. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I not follow the approved talking points? How refreshing that you think guests should be warned before facing challenging questions. I guess that's another difference between political spin and actual journalism." He gestured dramatically to the audience, clearly playing for their reaction. Wallace felt something snap inside her. Years of dealing with hostile interviews had taught her when someone was operating in bad faith. And Colbert had crossed that line within the first 5 minutes of what was supposed to be a promotional appearance. "You know what, Stephen? If you want to play journalist, you should probably start by learning the difference between challenging questions and character assassination. What you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's performance art designed to humiliate your guest for the entertainment of your audience." The words hung in the air, like electricity before a storm. Colbert's producers were frantically gesturing from the wings, clearly not expecting their host to go this far off script. But Colbert seemed energized by Wallace's pushback, as if her resistance was exactly what he had been hoping for. Character assassination. That's rich, coming from someone who spent years polishing the reputation of an administration that left office with approval ratings in the basement. Colbert fired back, his voice rising slightly. "Maybe if you had done more actual journalism back then instead of political theater, We wouldn't have needed quite so much cleanup afterward. Wallace stood up from her chair, her professional composure finally cracking. You want to talk about political theater? Look around, Stephen. You're performing for your audience right now, using me as a prop in your little ideological puppet show. This isn't an interview, it's an execution, and I'm not going to sit here and let you use your platform to settle whatever personal grudge you're nursing. Colbert's face flushed red as he realized his guest wasn't going to play the victim role he had scripted for her. Personal grudge? The only thing personal here is your inability to take responsibility for the damage you helped cause. You want to reinvent yourself as some kind of truth-telling journalist, but you can't even acknowledge the lies you helped spread when it mattered most. His voice carried across the studio with venom that shocked even his own production team. Wallace moved closer to his desk, her years of political combat experience taking over completely. You want to talk about lies, Stephen? Let's talk about the lie you're perpetrating right now. You invited me here under false pretenses, ambushed me with gotcha questions, and now you're trying to make yourself look like some kind of journalistic hero. The only person spreading misinformation in this room right now is you. The audience began murmuring among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating hostility. Several people in the front rows were looking toward the exits, unsure whether they were witnessing planned entertainment or an actual breakdown in professional decorum. Colbert's producers were making increasingly frantic hand signals from behind the cameras, but their host seemed completely committed to his destructive path. False pretenses? I invited a public figure to answer questions about her public record. If that feels like an ambush to you, maybe you should stick to the friendly confines of cable news, where nobody challenges your convenient narrative. Colbert shot back, his trademark humor completely absent now. Wallace laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Challenges my narrative? Stephen, you haven't asked me a single substantive question about policy, journalism, or my book. You've spent 10 minutes trying to prosecute me for decisions made by an entire administration during a complex geopolitical crisis. That's not journalism. That's a kangaroo court with laugh tracks. Colbert slammed his hand on his desk, causing his coffee mug to rattle. Don't lecture me about journalism when you spent years spinning fairy tales for politicians who got people killed. You want substance? Here's some substance. How do you sleep at night, knowing that your communication strategies helped sell a war that destroyed an entire region? The question crossed every line of professional broadcasting, and Wallace felt something fundamental shift in her approach to this confrontation. She was no longer trying to salvage a promotional appearance or maintain diplomatic relations with a fellow media personality. This had become a fight for her professional reputation and personal dignity. "How dare you?" Wallace said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "How dare you sit there in your comfortable, late night television chair and judge decisions made by people dealing with real national security threats in real time with incomplete information? You make jokes for a living, Stephen. You've never had to make a decision that affected anyone's life, except maybe your writing staff." Colbert stood up behind his desk, matching her intensity. "I make jokes, but at least I don't make excuses for war criminals. At least when I mislead people, it's clearly labeled as comedy, not disguised as public service." His words were calculated to inflict maximum damage, and the stunned silence from the audience suggested he was succeeding. Wallace stepped back, her political instincts finally overriding her combative impulses. She could see the cameras capturing every moment of this meltdown, and she realized that staying much longer would only provide more ammunition for whatever narrative Colbert was trying to create. "You know what, Stephen? This conversation is over. I came here as your guest, and you've treated me like a defendant in your personal political tribunal. Running away when the questions get tough? How very Washington of you," Colbert taunted, clearly trying to provoke her into staying for more punishment. Wallace gathered her purse and book from beside her chair, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the chaos surrounding her. I'm not running from tough questions. I've answered tough questions from actual journalists for decades. What I'm doing is refusing to participate in whatever sick entertainment you think you're providing for your audience. She turned toward the audience and spoke directly to them, bypassing Colbert entirely. I apologize that you came here expecting to see a civil discussion about politics and journalism. Instead, you got to watch a television host use his platform to settle personal scores and attack his guests. That's not entertainment, and it's certainly not the kind of discourse our democracy needs. Colbert realized he was losing control of the narrative as Wallace addressed his audience directly. Don't apologize to them. Apologize to the families of soldiers who died because of policies you helped promote. Apologize to the Iraqi civilians whose lives were destroyed by your communication strategies. The accusation was so far beyond the bounds of reasonable discourse that even some audience members audibly gasped. Wallace turned back to face him, and everyone in the studio could see that something fundamental had changed in her demeanor. The political operative who had survived years of Washington combat was fully engaged now. You want an apology, Stephen? Here's what I'm sorry for. I'm sorry I gave you the benefit of the doubt when I agreed to appear on your show. I'm sorry I assumed you would conduct yourself with the basic professionalism expected of someone in your position. And I'm sorry your audience has to witness you destroying your own credibility in real time. Colbert's face contorted with rage as he realized Wallace was dismantling his attempted ambush with surgical precision. My credibility? You're lecturing me about credibility while you're literally fleeing from accountability. This is exactly the kind of Washington behavior that got us into this mess in the first place. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the desperation behind his aggressive facade. Wallace paused at the edge of the stage, turning back one final time. Accountability. Stephen, I've spent the last 15 years of my career holding politicians accountable on television every single day. I've criticized Republicans and Democrats alike when they've failed the American people. What you're doing right now isn't accountability, it's public humiliation masquerading as moral superiority. The studio audience was completely silent now, many looking genuinely disturbed by what they were witnessing. Several people had pulled out their phones and were recording, clearly recognizing that they were watching something unprecedented in late-night television. Colbert's producers were having animated discussions in the wings, clearly debating whether to cut to commercial or let this train wreck continue. Public humiliation? The only thing humiliating here is watching you run away from your own record, Colbert pressed, his desperation becoming more obvious with each exchange. You can't just reinvent yourself as a journalist and pretend your past doesn't exist. Wallace walked back toward the desk, her political instincts telling her that leaving now would create the exact visual Colbert wanted. Nobody's running from anything, and nobody is pretending the past doesn't exist. What I won't do is sit here and let you distort that past to serve your own agenda. You want to have a real conversation about foreign policy decisions, the evolution of political communication, or the role of media in democracy. I'm happy to have that conversation. But that's not what this is. Colbert sensed an opportunity to regain control. Fine, let's have a real conversation. Tell me how someone goes from being a Republican operative to hosting a show that spends every day attacking Republican politicians. Doesn't that strike you as opportunistic? Wallace smiled for the first time since the interview began, recognizing that Colbert had finally revealed his real grievance. Ah, there it is. You're not angry about foreign policy or communication strategies. You're angry that I'm not staying in my assigned political lane. You're upset that someone with my background is criticizing the current Republican Party instead of defending it. The observation hit its mark, and Colbert's carefully constructed moral outrage began to crumble. "That's not— I mean, you're deflecting from the real issues here," he stammered, clearly caught off guard by Wallace's direct challenge to his motivations. "The real issue," Wallace continued, pressing her advantage, "is that you can't handle the idea that people can evolve in their thinking. You want politics to be a team sport where everyone stays loyal to their jersey no matter what. The fact that I'm willing to criticize politicians from both parties when they fail, the American people threatens your neat little narrative about political tribalism." Colbert's anger flared again, but this time it seemed more personal than performative. "Don't psychoanalyze me, Nicolle. You don't know anything about my motivations or my narrative. What I know is that you helped sell a war based on lies, and now you want credit for criticizing politicians who lie. That's not evolution. That's hypocrisy." Wallace had heard enough. The personal attacks, the distortions of her record, and the hostile atmosphere had pushed her past the point where diplomatic engagement was possible. "You know what, Stephen? You're right about one thing. I don't know your motivations, and frankly, I don't care anymore. What I do know is that this conversation has devolved into something that serves neither your audience nor the public discourse you claim to care about." She began walking toward the stage exit again, but Colbert wasn't finished. "So that's it? You're just going to leave when the conversation gets uncomfortable? How very typical of the Washington establishment." Wallace stopped and turned back one final time, her voice carrying across the studio with absolute clarity. "I'm leaving because you've made it impossible to have a productive conversation. You've turned what should have been a discussion about journalism and political analysis into a personal attack designed to humiliate your guest. That's not uncomfortable, Stephen. That's unprofessional." As she reached the wings, two security guards appeared, clearly summoned by the increasingly frantic producers. But instead of escorting her out quietly, Colbert made one final devastating mistake. "Security? Really? You're going to have me removed from my own show?" he called out, his voice now reaching levels that bordered on hysteria. Wallace turned back to face the audience one last time. "I'm not having anyone removed, Stephen. I'm simply leaving because this stopped being an interview the moment you decided to use your platform as a weapon instead of a forum for discussion." She looked directly into the main camera, addressing viewers at home. "Political discourse in this country is broken enough without television hosts contributing to the problem by ambushing their guests and turning interviews into ideological warfare." The security guards flanked her as she walked toward the exit, not because she had been ejected, but because the situation had deteriorated to the point where her safety might be at risk. Colbert, realizing that the optics were terrible, made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, Nicolle Wallace, everyone," he announced, to scattered, uncomfortable applause. But Wallace had the final word. As she reached the exit, she called back across the studio. "Next time you want to ambush a guest, Stephen, maybe warn them first. It's the least you can do, if you're going to pretend this is journalism." The studio doors closed behind her, leaving Colbert alone on stage with an audience that looked more shocked than entertained. That's the story of how one of the most respected names in political journalism found herself walking off one of television's biggest stages, not because she couldn't handle tough questions, but because she refused to be part of a host's personal vendetta disguised as public interest. What do you think? Should hosts be allowed to ambush their guests like this? Or should there be some basic standards of professional courtesy even in political interviews? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button and let me know what other behind-the-scenes stories you want to hear about.